Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today I'll be showing you a highly asked for full breakdown of all of the powered optics in Tarkov to decide which are good and which to avoid. The best of the best are fairly obvious, but outside of that there are some cheap contenders that can be used for specific purposes that we'll look at throughout this video. So to start with, what makes a scope good in the first place? I've broken this down into 4 different categories, the first one being how it performs on full auto, which is also related to the eye relief and the scope shadow around the edge of the optic when you're using it. The best scopes allow you to go full auto with pretty much any gun in the game and you can see your target the entire time, whereas the worst scopes end up blacking out the screen, so when you go full auto you actually can't see anything at all for the first 5 bullets or so. Point number 2 is how large the actual optic shows up on the screen. This often gives a better performance while you're sniping because it allows you to just see more on the screen itself, but it does cut down a little bit on your peripheral vision, so it's not always the be all and end all, but it is an interesting point to note. Number 3 is whether the scopes have a variable zoom or not. You'll find that most of the optics that people use have a variable zoom, having a short range mode and a long range mode, so almost all of them have a 1x and then some other function as well for longer range shooting. Finally, the scope must have a clean reticle to be thought of as a good optic. If the reticle gets in the way of you actually firing or it obstructs your vision in any way, then typically these ones are left behind and others with a better, cleaner reticle are used instead. Now purely for reference, I will be showing quite a lot of video of these optics being fired on full auto, so just so you know, I'm using a 62 FOV, which is kind of in the middle somewhere, which is what most Tarkov players use I think, because if you go too high on the FOV, the scope shadowing and the full auto performance actually gets worse if you do this. We're going to keep referencing back to this overall chart of all of them that I've tabulated out, so if you are a high FOV user, then you probably want to focus more on the full auto column than anything else, because you'll be more badly affected by this as the FOV increases in your settings. Secondly, the guns that we're using to showcase this is a 34 recoil M4, which has a high rate of fire, which is one of the ones that actually gets hurt by the full auto scope shadowing the most, and where that's not possible, i.e. the dovetail scopes, I've used a 43 recoil RD704. Those issues are typically less important on the AKs because of the lower fire rate, so they don't tend to jump quite as much on the initial few bullets, but it can still be an issue on the ones with high recoil such as the AKM series. Starting in size order, we have the PU 3.5 scope, which is the smallest scope on screen in the whole of Tarkov, and it doesn't have a full auto option because it only fits onto the SVT and the Mosin, so you can't actually use it with any guns that do this. It's not a very good scope with a fixed magnification, and the reticle isn't really that easy to use, but it is cheap, and normally you use this because you have to, i.e. using it with the SVT, which only supports this one optic. Next up is the Monstrum Tactical, which is a 2x magnification, and this almost doesn't really fit into this video actually, because the reason people tend to use this is more for close range fighting, but giving you a little bit of extra zoom over a normal red dot or a holographic. On this basis, being small on the screen isn't necessarily that big of a problem, and it is okay on full auto. Not the best, but definitely not that bad. The reticle is quite clean too, and it doesn't cost that much, so for what it's used for, it's actually a pretty decent scope. The one thing to bear in mind about this is that if you do decide to go up to the 2x rather than using a red dot or a holographic, you will suffer from the picture-in-picture FPS performance drop, which is associated with all optics. This is slightly unfortunate and sometimes is a reason to pick a 1x over this scope. Next we have the EOTech HHS-1, which is one of my least favourite scopes in the whole game. It's terrible on full auto, which is sort of what you want it for because it's a hybrid holographic and 3x. When it's on 3x mode, it's too small on the screen to really be that useful. The reticle isn't very clean either, and the only thing that it has going for it is that it isn't actually that expensive and that it has the switched magnification. It also does do some weird stuff to recoil as well. I think the perceived recoil is slightly higher on this one based on some testing that's been done previously. I don't have the footage to hand, but in my opinion just avoid this one if you can. Next we have the VOMZ Pillad, which is a bad scope. It is small and is terrible on full auto, but it is 4x as a fixed magnification, so you can get this on Jaeger 1 at the beginning of a wipe and use it on weapons that don't have a dovetail, which is really its only saving grace. Use this if you have no other option, but otherwise consider something else. Another one that's pretty bad is the NC Star Ado P4. This is small on screen and it has a terrible full auto performance, although to be fair it is a 3x and a 9x magnification, so you wouldn't necessarily expect it to perform that well on full auto anyway. The reticle itself is not very nice looking either, and one of the weird things about this is that although there is a backup sight red dot on the top, this has a strange sensitivity for a start, and it also has some picture-in-picture issues too, which is basically that you get the FPS drop when you're using the backup sight without using the main scope, which is really unusual and another reason to avoid it. The Swamp Fox Tri-Hawk is a little bit of an enigma. I quite like this optic because it's really good on full auto, but the fixed 3.5x magnification is a little bit too much to use this all the time. It's not very big on the screen, and because it has a fixed zoom, it means that you need to take a backup with you or use a canted sight if you're going to use this scope. I do quite like this for budget assault rifles because it does full auto well and it feels nice to use, and it's often cheaper scope on the flea market because it's given as a quest reward and it's not really used that much by the player base. The NPZ USP is our first dovetail, and this one is really bad, terrible on full auto, small on the screen, isn't variable and is stuck at 4 times, and the reticle itself is god, who knows what's going on here. This is awful, avoid this one at all costs. I mean, just look how much of the screen is blocked out on the left hand side, just terrible all around. To our first ACOG, the TA11D. This one is okay on full auto, it is not terrible, but it's also not really that good. It's still quite small on screen, and with a 3.5 times, it suffers from the same issues as the Swamp Fox Trihawk. To be honest, I think I'd rather just use the Swamp Fox because of the amount of screen real estate that it blocks out using the frame, and the full auto just isn't quite as good, so there's really no reason to use this when you have the Swamp Fox to hand. The Hensoldt FF is one of those scopes that's never used in the game because it has a minimum 4 times magnification and it doesn't full auto well at all. With the 16x on the top end, it's just way too big. You don't need that for really any shooting in Tarkov. It doesn't cost all that much, but the reticle isn't that good either, and there are just scopes that do what the FF does but better. Onto the hammer. Now, I think the hammer is more popular than it should be, and this is purely down to the way that it goes full auto. The 4 times mode isn't very good for using with the M4, for example, as you will see, and the screen size is medium, and it does have a variability because of the fact that you can put a delta point on top. But this means that you have to buy another scope as well to go with it, so it ends up not being as cheap as it looks. It is quite clean to use, but yeah, that full auto performance really makes me not like it, and I think that there are other optics that do what the hammer does but better. Now here we have another dovetail mounted version, the NPZ 1P78, which I just never see used ever because it goes on its own special dovetail mount before you can put the optic on top, and it looks really bad. But for the price that it is, I actually think this is really underrated. The full auto on it isn't amazing, but it is a 3 times scope, so that's maybe fair enough, but it is bigger than both the Swamp Fox and the first ACOG that we looked at. Yes, it isn't variable, but it is incredibly cheap, and I actually think it performs just as well as those other 2 that I mentioned. If you're running budget AKs with a dovetail mount, maybe give it a try. I don't think it's that bad. The other ACOG is again very similar. This one is a slightly higher zoom than the previous one at 4 times, but it's almost the same in most other ways. It has an average full auto, so it's not that great, but it is slightly bigger on the screen, and again, it's very, very cheap. I do slightly prefer the reticle on this one, as the little yellow cross I think is better than the triangle, but again, it's personal preference. So as we move up into the Elcan Spectre, we are typically going into that category of decent scopes with large screen size. This is an extremely popular choice in game, and it's not really surprising why when we have a look at its features. It full autos decently, not as well as some of the top scopes, but pretty well. It's large on the screen, and it has a variable zoom being 1 times and 4 times, so you can use it in both close combat and at ranged. The reticle itself is pretty clean, and it doesn't cost that much. There's a sneaky way that you can get this using the SOP mod mechanic barter by using 2 pro kills, buying the gun, and then selling the rest of the gun back except for the Elcan back to him, and you can get that for about 20,000 rubles if you pick your prices right. Overall, the Elcan probably is one of the best balance between performance and price in the game, so you can't really go wrong using it on everything. Here we see our first Schmidt & Bender scope, which is the largest version with the highest zoom. This is the 5-25, and obviously this isn't very good on full auto because the minimum zoom is a 5 times. This is much more of a DMR or sniping scope because of the top level of 25 times zoom, but it is expensive, and the main reason for this is that it sells to Jaeger for 57k, so this puts a ceiling on the scope's price on the flea market. For that price, I think you can get a better optic that is a little bit more usable because 5 and 25 is a little too high for me. Next up we have the Razor, which slightly surprised me being here in the list at about the middle because I thought in my mind that it was much bigger on screen than it actually is. I think the reason for this is the scope shadow is so low and it handles so nicely. It's often seen as the best scope in the game, so it feels bigger than it actually is. The Razor has a bit of everything. Excellent performance on full auto, relatively large on the screen, a variable scope having a 1 times and a 6 times for close combat and long range shooting. The reticle is incredibly clean, and of course this makes it very, very expensive. If you do Tarkov Shooter Part 8, you can get this for 5 fuel conditioners, but it's probably still cheaper on the flea market despite it being well over 100,000 rubles. Next up we have the Night Force Attacker, which is very similar to the Schmidt & Bender 5-25 in many ways, because this one has a minimum zoom of 7 and a max zoom of 16, which is way too big. This means that you can't full auto it, and although it is actually quite big on the screen, it's relatively expensive as well because it's used for gunsmith. Now you might be surprised to find the PSO here in the list, but it is really large on screen. It's not that bad on full auto, having a 4 times zoom, which is unfortunately not variable, which is one of the reasons why people don't use it. But this one is actually really underrated. The PSO is decent, but the only reason why people don't use it more, I think, is because it can only go on dovetail mounted weapons. Most of the DMRs and sniper rifles in Tarkov just simply don't have one, which means that you're stuck using it on AKs and things like that typically benefit from better scopes like the Elcan. The March Tactical. I don't really know what there is to say about this. It's a fixed 14 times zoom, so no one ever uses it. Now here we have the Kibber Arms Short Prism, and this one used to be called the Primary Arms. I don't know why they changed the name, maybe for licensing or copyright or something like that, I'm not really sure. But this is another surprising contender because this is typically a very cheap scope. It's about 20,000 rubles from Skier 2. It's definitely a you either love it or you hate it kind of optic, and it isn't supposed to be one of the best in the game because the reticle itself is a little bit weird and it's not that good on full auto, but for what it does and the price, it's okay. I personally like the 2.5 times zoom on it, and because the scope is quite big, you get a lot of screen area within the optic itself, which helps with spotting people. In my opinion, this works best with cheap weapons on semi-auto that hit really hard, something like the RFP. Next is the Leopold Mark IV. This is very similar to the March Tactical and has a 20 times only, so for the same reasons, we'll be skipping this one. The KMZ 1P59, 1P69, doesn't really matter which one you choose, is probably one of the most underrated budget optics in the entire game. With a minimum zoom of 3 times and a maximum of 10 times, it doesn't full auto well at all, but this is not really what it was supposed to be used for. One major benefit of this scope is that it has both a dovetail and a regular Picatinny mounting system, so that means that you can use it on pretty much every gun that has a long enough rail. The only quirk or weirdness about it is that because it has an illuminated reticle, you have to click twice to get to the different zoom scopes. So it starts off unilluminated, then it illuminates the 3 times, then it turns to 10 times unilluminated, and then to click again, it then illuminates the optic. So that's one weird thing about it, but otherwise it's really cheap and allows you to snipe on an extreme budget. Next we have either the second place or the joint first place scope depending on who you speak to, which is the Voodoo. Similar to the Razor in many ways, it has both a 1 times and a 6 times, it's large on the screen with this variable optic, and it goes really well on full auto. It has an extremely clean reticle, although some do prefer the Razor's one, and it is quite expensive for this reason. However, there is a G-Phone barter at Skier 3 where you use 2 G-Phone X's to barter for one of these Voodoos, and these prices sometimes come down to about 35,000 rubles, which means that you can get the Voodoo for 70k. You can only get one per reset, so look out for when the G-Phone X's are cheap, buy them up, and then slowly build up a stockpile of Voodoos in your stash. In 5th largest place, we have the Bravo 4, which again might surprise you slightly. This one I prefer to the Hammer. It is better on full auto, and it allows you to mount any red dot that you like on top because it has a rail rather than a specific mount for a delta point. This means that you have 1 times and 4 times switching between the two, and the reticle is okay. Kind of depends on your personal preference here, but I think it's certainly usable. As the 4th largest on the screen, we now have the Schmidt & Bender 1x8, which is an excellent scope, and I would say it is in the top 3 along with the Voodoo and the Razor, probably in 3rd place. It is excellent on full auto, and it has a 1 times and an 8 times mode. Now the 8 times is slightly less useful than the 6x arguably, but it's still decent and certainly usable. The reticle is incredibly clean on this, and it's not as expensive as the other two. It's certainly pricey, but it's not over 100,000 rubles normally. I think part of this is down to legacy. In the past, the 1 time scope used to have a really weird sensitivity, so it was extremely slow, but since that got fixed, the whole scope is really nice to use now. Sometimes later in the wipe, once people have used it for their quests, you can buy the keycard with a blue marking relatively cheap and barter that for a G28, which actually has one of these scopes on top. Sometimes you can sell the whole gun back and get this scope cheaper than you could buy it on the flea. In 3rd place on scope size on screen, we have the Valde. The Valde is pretty good in almost every category. It has a 1 times and a 6 times mode, so it's variable, it's big on screen as we said, and the reticle is pretty clean too. The only thing that lets it down is its full auto performance. This isn't terrible, but the Valde suffers quite a lot from scope shadowing, which is really the main point that lets it down. Again, it is still used quite a lot by people who are looking to snipe on a budget because it's pretty good so long as you're not trying to go on full auto. The last 2 scopes are really big on the screen compared to the others, and the 2nd place one is the Schmidt & Bender 3-12. Despite having a minimum zoom of 3, it's actually not that bad on full auto, but the massive screen area plus the 3 times and the 12 times mode are very usable on a map like Lighthouse. I personally think this is one of the best DMR scopes available with a sidearm. One thing that you have to remember about all of these larger optics is they can be mounted into rings with mounting points on the top for red dots and other things, so you're not just stuck with the zooms that you've got available. So I think the Schmidt & Bender 3-12 could be used with, say, a delta point or something and be a really good all-around scope. But because it doesn't have that 1 times mode, this kind of keeps it out of the top 3. And finally, as the scope with the largest screen area in the entire game, is the TAC-30. There are 2 things about the TAC-30 that people don't like, and firstly, it's its full auto performance. If you're using it with a weapon like the M4, it just isn't very good, and you can't really see your target at the beginning of the spray, despite the fact that you're on a 1 times magnification mode. The second thing is the reticle. The big red ring of doom a lot of people don't really like, and so that's another thing that puts people off. But it is quite an expensive scope and people do tend to use it. If you like it, you often use it a lot. I think it is a decent scope to use with DMRs because you just don't have the same scope shadowing problems, and there is a cheap barter for it using 3 kvass. You can drink the kvasses down to 1 out of 60 and then hand them in when they're nearly done, and you basically get a TAC 30 for pretty much free. So overall, what are my favourite optics to use in the game? Well, obviously the best 3 are the Razor, the Voodoo and the Schmidt & Bender 1x8, and I spend my time mostly with the Voodoo because of the barter and picking up flea market items cheaply. Then if you're looking at something slightly cheaper but usable in the DMR category where you don't want to go on full auto, is the TAC 30, the Valde and the Schmidt & Bender 3 to 12, depending on exactly how far out you want to reach. The TAC 30 obviously has a 4 times max, the Valde with a 6 and the Schmidt up to 12. With the Schmidt you'll have to bring a sidearm or use one of the special mounts that allows you to add a red dot to the top. But adding to your assault rifles and going on full auto, I think the Bravo and the Elcan are basically the staple for this, if you don't want to use one of the Razor, Voodoo or the Schmidt 1-8. The Bravo is also pretty cheap, so I think this one is surprisingly good and I don't think it's used enough. Then finally, on a budget, you have either the Monstrum if you want to reach out just a little bit further than having a red dot or a holographic, or the Kibber Arms Short Prism if you want to have more screen area and you're using something on semi-auto but at close-ish range. For sniping on a budget, the KMZ 1P59 or 1P69 are extremely good for what they do. Just make sure you bring something to allow you to fight in close combat just in case you get in trouble because the minimum zoom is 3 times. So next up, go and check out my ultimate guide to ammo in patch 13.5. Otherwise, as usual, big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.